Hello, in this video we're going to be discussing variables and data types. Make sure that you process this chapter very carefully because this lays the foundation for everything else we're going to do in this term. If you don't understand the concepts in this chapter, you're going to be lost pretty much for the rest of the semester. So make sure you get lots and lots of practice and take your time reading and processing these videos. All right, so what we want to learn in this chapter is about how to declare variables, display the variable values. We're going to talk about several different common data types, and the videos are kind of broken up. One of the videos is about numeric, one of them is about string, one of them is about Boolean. We're also going to learn about methods to manipulate data, so changing the format, changing between data types, and then we're also going to briefly touch on the arithmetic operators, adding, subtracting, multiply, divide, and modulus. Some key terms to know before we get started. A constant is a value that cannot be changed after a program is compiled. So for example, in chapter 1, when we wrote our Hello World program, we wrote hello world inside of quotation marks. That was a literal string. That was a constant because it couldn't be changed. No matter how we run the program always spit out the same words, hello world. Well, we're going to learn something very useful now in chapter 2, which is using variables instead of constants. So a variable is a named location in computer memory that can hold different values at different points in time. So you can have a string, maybe at one point in time the string is hello world, and maybe a different time the string is hello, how are you? Okay. But it's the same variable that we're referring to. So think back to your high school days of learning algebra, solve for x. X has some value, it's a variable. X was a letter that we used in place of a number. That's kind of how you can think of variables. It's something that we give a name that represents something else, either a number or a string or something else. And you'll see many examples of variables. You're going to become experts at using variables by the end of this chapter. Data type means the format and the size, in technical terms, the amount of memory on the computer that's occupied by a data item. And there are several intrinsic data types. This is a typo. It says built-in date types, but that's supposed to be built-in data types. All right. So every programming language has a set of intrinsic types, and they can vary sometimes between different programming languages. Table 2.1 shows you the intrinsic data types for the C# language. Now I've highlighted here in yellow the ones that we are going to use in this class. So this is a good reference to have for all of the different options that are available to you. But as far as all of the examples and homeworks and exams in this particular course, you only need to use the ones that are highlighted in yellow here. So if you need to use a whole number, you're going to use the int or int data type. If you're using a number, if you need a number with a decimal, you will use the double data type. A double refers to a number with a decimal point in it. If we're using money, we might on occasion use the decimal data type, but for the most part, we're just going to stick to double, just out of habit and consistency while we're learning the basics of the C# programming language. Some other data types that we're going to be using are char, which is short for character, bool, which is Boolean, and a string, which is text. And we're going to talk about all of these in chapter 2 today. All right, so how do we actually use variables? A variable declaration is a statement that names a variable and reserves storage for it in computer memory. The equal sign in programming is the assignment operator. Okay, so you need to think about the equal sign differently than you're used to thinking about it. We don't use the equal sign for any sort of math calculations in the C# programming language. We use the equal sign to assign a value to a variable. Now, there are three different things on this slide. There's initialization, simple declaration, and assignment. And I'm going to show you what these mean by doing an example. So I'm going to switch over to a notepad. And we're going to create a new application. So let's follow the same process that we followed with the past examples. So please follow along. I'll try and go at a pace where you can follow along. If you get behind, you can pause or slow down the video. Or if I'm going too slow, you can speed up the video. So as always, we're going to start with a class, and I'm going to name this ice cream. The application, the example that I'm going to use throughout the videos today is an app for an ice cream shop. And always need our curly braces for our ice cream class, for any class that we're doing. Within the curly braces, we're going to have our static void main method. Oops. And inside that method, we're going to do a bunch of stuff to practice with variables. Okay, so in order to create a variable, you first use the keyword for the data type you want. So if I wanted to have a variable that stored the price of a scoop of ice cream, I might use the double data type because the price is going to be a number that has a decimal point in it. So I don't want to use an int or integer because those are only for whole numbers. So I'm going to type the keyword double, and then I'm going to think of a name for this variable. And our variable names, by convention, we use camel casing, which is lowercase at the beginning, but uppercase on any subsequent words. So I'm going to call this variable num scoops using camel casing, which is short for number of scoops. Oh, whoop, excuse me. We're doing the price, and then I'll come back and do number of scoops as my next variable. So we're going to price per scoop. Okay. All right, if I just put a semicolon here, this is what we call a variable declaration. So I have declared to the computer that I want a variable of type double, which is called price per scoop. Okay. Now, if I want to assign some value to that variable, I type the variable name, and then I type the assignment operator, which is the equal sign. And then on the right side of the equals, I put the value that I want. So let's say the price per scoop is 1.25. Don't forget the semicolon at the end. Okay. So this is a variable declaration. This is a variable assignment. We've done it on two separate lines, the declaration and the assignment on two separate lines. You can also do it on the same line, and this is what we call variable initialization. So let's do another variable. This time we're going to do the number of scoops. Now the number of scoops, we're going to use an integer because generally speaking, you don't have like 1.5 scoops of ice cream, right? You can have 1 scoop, 2 scoops, 3 scoops. So for this variable, we're going to use an integer. And the keyword in C# is int. We're going to give it a name. So I'll call this num scoops. Now, instead of just declaring it on this line in this statement, I'm going to initialize this variable by both declaring it and assigning a value at the same time. So let's say 3 scoops, and then semicolon at the end. So this is variable initialization. Variable declaration, variable assignment. And if you put them together in one line, so you can see we've done a declaration and we've also done an assignment at the same time. That is variable initialization. Let me switch back to the PowerPoint slide. Okay, so on this slide, I've just shown you kind of a template. And then we did an example to show how each of these 3 things works. Okay, now we've got an example of displaying those variable values out to the user. You'll see here this example uses both the write line and the write methods. The difference between the write line method and the write method is simply that write line gives you a complete line and then skips down to the next line, whereas the write method stays on the same line. So you'll see in this example, they wanted to have the money is and then have the value of that variable on the same line. So that's the difference between write line and write. And I'll show you an example of that with our ice cream example here in just a second. Well, in fact, let's do that right now. Okay, so we've assigned some variables, but unless we display them out to the user, it's not going to do us much good. So let's save this file. I'm going to save it. I have a folder called code on my desktop. And I'm going to save this as ice cream, because that was the name of the class, .cs. Now I'm going to jump over to my developer command prompt. I'm going to change directories to where I have my code saved. And I'm going to compile. This is a good idea anyway, to see if we have any errors. We don't want to go through the entire example before we check for errors. We want to be constantly compiling to check for syntax errors. CSC icecream.cs. Okay, so we have some what we call warning errors here. It says the variable price per scoop is assigned, but its value is never used. And same for a variable called numscoops, which is what I was mentioning before. We've created these variables and assigned values to them, but C#, the compiler, is just telling us that was kind of pointless of you to create these variables because you haven't really done anything with them. That's okay. We'll get to that in a minute. I do want to note, though, that our file did still compile. So if I go to my folder where I have my code stored, you'll see that it created an executable file. So these were just warnings. These weren't errors that prevented the compiler from compiling the code. Okay. So if I try and run that code, I'll type icecream.exe. What do you think is going to happen when I run this application? Absolutely nothing. It created the variables in the background, but we haven't actually done anything with them. So now let's go back to our code. And let's display these values. So we could say system.console.writeLine. Okay, and now this time, so in the past, we've always put a literal string or a constant inside of our WriteLine method input. But anywhere that you can put a constant value, like a literal string or a number, you can replace that with a variable. So here inside of the WriteLine method, instead of literally typing a set of text inside quotation marks, we could replace that with a variable name. So we could put the variable num scoops in here. So I'm going to save that. Jump back to command prompt, recompile. It's probably still going to, give me a warning about price per scoop, but now it doesn't give me the warning about num scoops because I've actually used that variable in some other statement. So now if I run my application, you'll see that it has spit out the number 3 on a line. Okay. So above this line, whoops, I'm going to write another line, system.console.writeLine. And in here, I'm going to put a literal string. I'm going to say, customer asked for, and then it will tell me the number of scoops that the customer asked for. So save my file. Jump back to the command prompt, compile again, and run the application. Say customer asked for 3. Now you see how these are on different lines. That goes back to what I was mentioning a minute ago about the difference between the WriteLine method and the write method. So if we actually change, if here, instead of using the WriteLine method, if we use the write method, then it won't skip down to the next line when it gets to the end of this string. I'll just show you that real quick. Yep, now it's all on the same line. Okay, another trick we can use with the WriteLine or write method is to use what's called a placeholder. Basically, a placeholder, it has some fixed text, and you can also put variable text in there. So the format is that you put a pair of curly braces inside of your text, inside of your literal string, inside of the WriteLine method, with a number, a list number, starting with 0. So anytime we use lists in programming, and you're going to see this a lot as we go throughout the term, lists in programming start with 0 instead of with 1. So you always count 0, 1, 2, 3, 4, etc. when you're using lists in the program in C# and in several other programming languages, most programming languages actually. Okay, so the idea is inside of a literal string, you can put a number starting with 0 inside curly braces. And then at the end of that string, you put a comma. And then for every number that you have in curly braces inside your literal string, you can put a variable, the name of a variable after the comma. And whatever the value of that variable is, it will be stuck inside that placeholder of the string. So let me show you with our ice cream example exactly what I mean. So here I'm actually going to comment out these 2 lines. And up above, I am going to use a placeholder to do the same thing as this code does on the 2 lines, but I'm going to do it in 1 line with a placeholder. So here I'm going to type system, well, you know what? To save some space, I'm actually going to, let's review the using keyword. Up at the top of my code, I'm going to put using static system.console so that I don't have to keep typing that over and over and over again. So using static system.console, semicolon. All right, so when I do that, that means that I don't have to type all of this out here, because C# will automatically be looking in the system namespace in the console class for any of the methods that are inside of that class, such as the write method or the WriteLine method. So that makes our code a little shorter, easier to read. All right, so on this line, I'm going to use a placeholder which is built into the WriteLine method. I'm going to put my closing parentheses and my semicolon now so I don't forget them. Okay. All right, so here for the input of the WriteLine method, I'm going to put customer asked for, and then I'm going to use a curly brace with a 0 inside for a placeholder, and then a comma, and after the comma, I'm going to put the variable that I want to replace this placeholder. So C#, when it processes this code, starts from the top, process, process, process. When it gets to this line and processes this string, it's going to say, oh, there's a placeholder here. So I'm going to replace this with whatever is in the variable following the next comma. Okay? And if I had another variable, or excuse me, another placeholder, then to replace placeholder number 1, it would look for the variable after the next comma after that. So we're just making a list of variables by commas, and then those that list is referred to by the numbers inside the curly braces, 0, 1, and so forth. Okay. All right. We're only going to use one placeholder in this particular line of code. So customer asked for curly brace, comma, num scoops. And in fact, let's make this even more interesting. So after the placeholder, we're going to put another space and the word scoops. And we don't want to forget our closing quotation mark. Okay, so we've got as a literal string, customer asked for, and then we have placeholder, scoops. And that placeholder is going to be replaced by whatever number we've stored in this variable, which might change over time. In our particular program as we have it now, it won't change. But we'll see as we go through the next few chapters how you can change values in variables and how that's very useful. All right, so let's take a minute. If I've gone too fast, you can pause and catch up, and then I'm going to save and test it out. A little shortcut in the developer command prompt, if you hit the up arrow, then you can cycle through, up and down arrow, you can cycle through the last several commands that you've entered. So if I don't want, if I'm constantly testing the same code in the developer command prompt, instead of typing out CSC icecream.cs every single time, I can just use the up and down arrow to find that command and then hit enter. All right, we've still got a warning because we still haven't used our price per scoop variable, but that's okay. It looks like there were no other errors. Everything else should be working. So we can test. We've compiled it. Now we can test it. And it successfully did the same thing. Customer asked for 3 scoops. All right, now I'm going to add some comments because it's just a good idea when you start to have more than 1 or 2 statements in your code to add comments to remind yourself or others what exactly your code does. Okay. So in this comment, I'm just going to write the placeholder statement above does similar function as the code commented out below. All right. So I could also add some comments here. Declaration. And this is, if you have the double forward slashes, you can type whatever you want after that because C# is going to totally ignore these lines. Declaration and assignment on separate lines. So I'm always going to try and leave a lot of comments so that when I post my code on Titanium, if you download my code, you'll understand how I've coded things. Variable initialization. That's a funky word to spell. Initialization. Okay. And that is the end of our first video I will post this particular set of code as ice cream 1 on the course website, but I'm going to actually continue using this code in as my example in the next several videos. But I'll just save it as several different files, ice cream 1, ice cream 2, and so forth on Titanium. But if you're following along and doing all of these videos at once, we're just going to continue using the same ice cream program file. If you haven't caught all the way up on this one and you want to start on the next video, then you can download the ice cream 1 file and start from that point.